The morning sun cast long shadows across the forward operating base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her medical supplies for what felt like the 100th time. The canvas walls of the medical tent fluttered gently in the desert breeze, creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 6 months. At 24, she had already seen more trauma than most emergency room doctors back home would witness in their entire careers. Sarah had joined the Army as a medic straight out of nursing school, driven by a desire to serve her country and use her skills where they were needed most. What she hadn't expected was how quickly she would adapt to life on the front lines, or how her fellow soldiers would come to see her as just another nurse in the medical tent. It was a perception she had learned not to correct, finding it easier to let people believe what they wanted rather than explain the extensive combat training that had shaped her into something far more dangerous than her gentle demeanor suggested. The base was located in a volatile region where insurgent activity had been increasing steadily over the past month. Intelligence reports indicated possible coordinated attacks, but life on the base continued with its usual routine. Soldiers would come and go on patrol, return with minor injuries that Sarah would treat with practiced efficiency, and she would send them back to their duties with a smile and words of encouragement that reminded them of home. Sergeant Mike Coleman was one of her regular patients, a gruff infantry soldier who seemed to find new ways to injure himself on every patrol. This particular morning, he sat on the examination table while Sarah cleaned a scrape on his forearm that he had gotten from sliding under a fence during a reconnaissance mission. "You know, Doc," Mike said, using the nickname all the soldiers had given her despite knowing she was technically a medic, "you remind me of my sister back in Ohio. She's a nurse at the children's hospital there. Same gentle hands, same way of making everything seem less scary than it actually is." Sarah smiled as she applied antiseptic to his wound. "Your sister sounds like a wonderful person. I bet she's proud of what you're doing out here." "She worries too much," Mike replied with a shrug. "Keeps writing letters telling me to stay safe, as if I have complete control over whether some insurgent decides to take a shot at us. But having you here makes it easier, you know, knowing that if something happens, there's someone like you to patch us up." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Private Jessica Chun, who had twisted her ankle during morning PT. As Sarah examined the swelling, she noticed Chun studying her hands with curiosity. "You have really steady hands," Chun observed. "My mom's a surgeon, and she always said you could tell a lot about someone's training by watching their hands work. Yours move like you've done a lot more than basic medical training." Sarah continued her examination without looking up. "Nursing school teaches you to be precise," she replied simply, though the truth was far more complex. Her hands had been steadied by months of advanced combat medical training, hours spent learning to perform life-saving procedures under simulated fire, and countless exercises designed to keep her calm and focused regardless of the chaos around her. The medical tent served not just as a treatment facility, but as a gathering place where soldiers could briefly escape the constant tension of deployment. Sarah had become something of a counselor and confidant, listening to stories about home, relationship troubles, and the fears that kept soldiers awake at night. She had a way of making people feel heard without judgment, a skill that served her well both as a medical professional and as someone who understood the psychological toll of combat. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the base's communications officer, was another frequent visitor to the medical tent. Unlike the others who came for treatment, he often stopped by just to talk. He had confided in Sarah about his struggle with the responsibility of coordinating missions that put his fellow soldiers in harm's way. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making the right calls," he had told her during one of their conversations. "Every decision I make affects real people, real lives. Back home, the worst mistake I could make was ordering the wrong supplies for the office. Here, a wrong call could get someone killed." Sarah had listened patiently, offering the kind of support that came naturally to her. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah understood his burden better than he could imagine. Her own training had prepared her for split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and she carried the weight of that responsibility even as she maintained her role as the caring nurse who bandaged wounds and offered comfort. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, had established strict protocols for medical personnel. As the only medical officer on the base, Sarah was considered too valuable to risk on patrol missions. Her role was clearly defined as remaining in the medical tent, available for emergencies and routine care. It was a decision that made tactical sense, but one that sometimes left Sarah feeling isolated from the reality her fellow soldiers faced beyond the base perimeter. Captain Williams, who led most of the patrol missions, had made his position clear during one of their few interactions. "I respect what you do here, Martinez," he had said, "but combat is a different world. It's not something you can understand from inside this tent, no matter how many wounded soldiers you treat." Sarah had simply nodded, accepting his assessment without argument. There was no point in explaining that her understanding of combat came from extensive training designed to prepare her for exactly the kind of situations Williams and his men faced every day. Her combat medic training had included urban warfare scenarios, hostile fire situations, and advanced tactical medicine that went far beyond the scope of traditional nursing. The irony was not lost on her that while her fellow soldiers saw her as someone to be protected, she possessed skills that could potentially save their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Her training had included weapons handling, tactical movement, and combat first aid procedures designed for use under fire. She could perform emergency surgery with makeshift tools, navigate hostile territory, and provide medical support in combat situations that would overwhelm most medical professionals. But Sarah had learned that sometimes the most valuable service she could provide was simply being the person her fellow soldiers believed her to be. In a world full of violence and uncertainty, there was something powerful about maintaining a space where healing and comfort were the primary concerns. Her medical tent had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where soldiers could remember their humanity and find a momentary respite from the harsh realities of their deployment. The daily routine of base life had a comforting predictability that belied the danger lurking beyond the perimeter. Morning formation, patrol assignments, equipment checks, and the constant hum of radio communications created a rhythm that made the extraordinary circumstances feel almost normal. Sarah had found her place within this routine, providing medical care that ranged from treating minor injuries to managing more serious trauma that resulted from the increasing insurgent activity in the region. Dr. James Parker, a visiting military physician who rotated between several bases in the region, had become something of a mentor to Sarah during his periodic visits. Unlike the other soldiers, he understood the full scope of her training and capabilities, though he too respected the role she had chosen to maintain. "You're wasted in that tent," he had told her during his last visit. "With your training, you could be making a real difference on the front lines. The combat medics I've worked with in other units credit people like you with saving lives that would have been lost otherwise." Sarah had appreciated his confidence, but remained committed to her current role. "Someone needs to be here," she had replied. "These soldiers need to know there's always someone available when they come back from patrol. That certainty is worth something too." The truth was more complicated than she could explain to Dr. Parker or anyone else on the base. Sarah had chosen to downplay her combat capabilities not out of fear or uncertainty about her skills, but because she understood that sometimes the most effective way to serve was to provide stability rather than add another variable to an already volatile situation. Her presence in the medical tent represented safety and care, qualities that were often in short supply in a combat zone. The relationship between soldiers and their medic was unique in military culture. Sarah had learned that her fellow soldiers needed to see her as someone distinct from the violence that surrounded them. She was their connection to a world where healing mattered more than destruction, where someone's primary concern was their well-being rather than their tactical effectiveness. It was a role that required its own kind of courage and discipline. As the weeks had passed, Sarah had begun to notice subtle changes in the base's security posture. Patrol routes were being varied more frequently, guard rotations had been increased, and There was a tension in the air that suggested intelligence reports were indicating elevated threat levels. Colonel Harrison had called several meetings with his senior staff that excluded medical personnel, but Sarah could sense the increased vigilance in the way soldiers moved and spoke. Sergeant Coleman had mentioned during one of his visits that patrols were encountering more sophisticated improvised explosive devices and that insurgent tactics seemed to be evolving rapidly. "It's like they're learning our patterns," he had confided to Sarah while she treated a cut on his hand from handling damaged equipment. "Every time we adapt, they seem to be one step ahead." The medical tent had become a place where information flowed freely, often giving Sarah a broader picture of the tactical situation than her official briefings provided. Soldiers would share observations and concerns while she worked, creating an informal intelligence network that kept her informed about developing threats. It was information she processed carefully, always aware that her role required her to balance medical preparedness with operational security. Private Anderson, a young soldier on his first deployment, had sought Sarah's advice about managing the stress of constant vigilance. "I can't shake the feeling that something bad is going to happen," he had told her. "Every patrol feels like we're walking into a trap, but we have to keep going out there." Sarah had counseled him on techniques for managing combat stress, while privately noting that his instincts might be more accurate than he realized. The increased tension on the base was palpable, and her own training had taught her to trust those subtle indicators that suggested a change in the threat environment. But her role required her to provide comfort and support rather than validation of fears that could undermine operational effectiveness. The challenge of maintaining her cover identity had become more complex as the soldiers on the base had grown to trust her completely. They shared their fears, their tactical concerns, and their observations with the assumption that she was simply a caring nurse who would listen without judgment. In reality, Sarah was processing their information through the lens of her combat training, building a picture of the evolving threat that her official position didn't provide access to. Captain Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, had begun stopping by the medical tent more frequently as patrol schedules intensified. As one of the base's senior officers, he carried the weight of decisions that put soldiers at risk, and Sarah had become one of the few people he felt comfortable discussing those burdens with. "The thing about command," he had explained during one of their conversations, "is that you're always balancing acceptable risk against mission requirements. Every patrol we send out could result in casualties, but the intelligence gathering and security operations are essential for protecting the larger mission." Sarah understood the complexity of his position better than he knew. Her own training had included instruction on tactical decision-making under pressure, and she recognized the careful calculations that went into every operational choice. But she maintained her role as listener and counselor, providing emotional support without revealing the depth of her understanding of military strategy. The medical tent's position at the center of the base gave Sarah an excellent vantage point for observing the daily operations that kept the facility functioning. She watched the careful coordination of supply deliveries, the precision of guard rotations, and the subtle adjustments in security procedures that reflected the changing threat environment. Her medical training had taught her to notice details and patterns, skills that transferred naturally to tactical observation, even when that wasn't her official responsibility. Specialist Thompson, who worked in the base's intelligence section, had developed a habit of stopping by the medical tent for treatment of chronic headaches that Sarah suspected were stress-related. During these visits, he would sometimes share observations about insurgent activity patterns that painted a concerning picture of organized and escalating threats. "They're getting bolder," he had told Sarah during his most recent visit. "The surveillance we're picking up suggests they're planning something bigger than the usual harassment attacks. Colonel Harrison is keeping the details classified, but everyone in intelligence knows something significant is coming." Sarah had treated his headache with appropriate medication while processing the implications of his information. Her combat training had included instruction on threat assessment and tactical intelligence, giving her the tools to understand the broader picture that Thompson's fragments were revealing. But she maintained her role as medical caregiver, focusing on his immediate health needs while privately noting the strategic intelligence he had shared. The isolation of forward operating bases created unique social dynamics that Sarah had learned to navigate carefully. The medical tent served as neutral ground where rank mattered less than it did elsewhere on the base, creating opportunities for candid conversations that wouldn't occur in other settings. Soldiers would share information and concerns more freely while receiving medical care, trusting Sarah's discretion and assuming her lack of combat experience meant she wouldn't fully understand the implications of what they were telling her. This assumption worked to Sarah's advantage, allowing her to gather intelligence about the base's readiness and the evolving threat environment without raising suspicions about her true capabilities. She had learned to ask questions that seemed motivated by medical concern rather than tactical curiosity, maintaining her cover while building a comprehensive understanding of their situation. The morning routine had become a meditation of sorts for Sarah, a time when she could prepare herself mentally for whatever the day might bring. She would inventory her supplies, check her equipment, and review the latest medical intelligence about potential threats in the region. It was during these quiet moments that she sometimes allowed herself to consider how different her experience might be if her fellow soldiers knew the full extent of her training and capabilities. The question that occupied her thoughts most frequently was whether maintaining her current role was truly serving the mission or whether circumstances might eventually require her to reveal her combat capabilities. Her training had prepared her for situations where medical personnel might need to take on combat roles, but the decision to do so carried significant implications for her relationship with the soldiers who depended on her for medical care and emotional support. Dr. Parker's words during his last visit had resonated with Sarah more than she had let on. The reality of modern warfare, he had said, is that the lines between combat and non-combat roles are increasingly blurred. Medical personnel need to be prepared for anything, and sometimes the most valuable contribution they can make is adapting to circumstances that weren't anticipated in their original mission planning. Sarah understood the truth of his observation, but she also recognized that her current role was providing value that might be difficult to replace. The soldiers on the base trusted her completely, saw her as a source of stability and care, and depended on the medical tent as a space where they could be vulnerable without compromising their operational effectiveness. These were contributions that couldn't be easily measured but were nonetheless essential to maintaining morale and unit cohesion. The challenge was that Sarah could sense changes in the threat environment that suggested her combat skills might soon be needed. The intelligence fragments she had gathered from treating various soldiers painted a picture of escalating insurgent activity and increasingly sophisticated attacks. Her training told her that the base's current security posture, while adequate for routine threats, might not be sufficient for the kind of coordinated assault that seemed to be developing. But revealing her combat capabilities would fundamentally change her relationship with every soldier on the base. Instead of being the caring nurse who provided comfort and healing, she would become another warrior whose primary value was measured in tactical effectiveness. It was a transformation that couldn't be undone, and Sarah wasn't certain it was necessary yet. The afternoon brought the usual stream of soldiers seeking treatment for minor injuries and routine medical care. Each interaction reinforced Sarah's understanding of how her fellow soldiers perceived her and how much they valued the role she had chosen to maintain. But it also provided additional intelligence about the developing situation that made her increasingly concerned about the base's vulnerability to the kind of attack her training had taught her to anticipate. The radio crackled to life just after dawn, carrying news that would shift the entire dynamic of the base. Patrol Alpha had encountered what appeared to be advanced surveillance equipment positioned near one of their regular routes, suggesting that insurgent forces were conducting detailed reconnaissance of their operations. Colonel Harrison's voice carried a tension that Sarah had rarely heard as he called for increased security measures and modified patrol schedules. Sarah was restocking medical supplies when Sergeant Coleman burst through the tent flap, his face grim with concern that went beyond his usual complaints about patrol conditions. His left shoulder showed signs of strain, likely from carrying heavy equipment during an extended mission, but his demeanor suggested that physical discomfort was the least of his worries. "Doc, we need to talk," he said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this tent, understood?" Sarah nodded while continuing to organize her supplies, maintaining the calm professionalism that had become her trademark. "Of course, Mike. What's troubling you?" Coleman settled onto the examination table with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of information he wasn't supposed to share. "The surveillance equipment we found isn't some amateur setup. This is military-grade stuff, the kind of gear that requires serious training to operate effectively. Someone out there has been watching us for weeks, maybe months, learning our patterns and routines." Sarah's hands continued their methodical work while her mind processed the implications of Coleman's revelation. Her combat training had included instruction on enemy surveillance techniques and the kind of intelligence gathering that typically preceded coordinated attacks. The discovery Coleman described suggested a level of planning and sophistication that elevated the threat significantly beyond routine insurgent harassment. "What does Colonel Harrison think about the situation?" Sarah asked, maintaining her tone of concerned curiosity rather than tactical interest. "That's what has everyone worried," Coleman replied, rolling his injured shoulder experimentally. "The colonel is bringing in additional security personnel and considering a temporary evacuation of non-essential personnel. But here's the thing, Doc. They're classifying medical personnel as non-essential for evacuation purposes." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The suggestion that medical personnel might be evacuated indicated that command anticipated a level of violence that would make their presence more of a liability than an asset. But it also suggested that leadership didn't fully understand the capabilities that some medical personnel might bring to a defensive situation. "Have they given any timeline for these potential evacuations?" Sarah asked while beginning her examination of Coleman's shoulder. "That's classified information that I probably shouldn't be sharing," Coleman said with a meaningful look. "But, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to make sure they had all their personal affairs in order, they might want to do that within the next 48 hours. The subtext was clear. Command expected some kind of significant action within the next 2 days, and they were preparing for the possibility that medical personnel might need to be removed for their safety. Sarah continued her examination while considering how this development affected her own decision-making process. Private Chun arrived for a follow-up examination of her ankle injury, but her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by the same tension that seemed to be affecting everyone on the base. As Sarah checked the healing progress, Chun shared information that added another piece to the developing picture. "My squad was doing perimeter checks this morning," Chun said quietly, "and we found evidence of recent movement in areas where we haven't seen any activity for months. It's like someone has been systematically mapping our defensive positions and looking for weaknesses." Sarah noted that Chen's ankle was healing well, but also processed the tactical significance of her observation. The combination of sophisticated surveillance equipment and systematic reconnaissance suggested an enemy force that was preparing for a coordinated assault designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in the base's defenses. "Are you concerned about the increased security measures?" Sarah asked while applying fresh wrapping to Chen's ankle. "Honestly, Doc, I'm more concerned about what they're not telling us," Chen replied. "The officers are trying to maintain normal routines, but everyone can feel that something big is coming. The question is whether we're as prepared as we think we are." Sarah understood Chen's concern at a level that her role as medical personnel didn't officially encompass. Her combat training had included detailed instruction on base defense tactics and the kind of coordinated attacks that insurgent forces were capable of mounting with proper planning and equipment. The intelligence that soldiers were sharing with her painted a picture of exactly the kind of threat her training had prepared her to recognize and potentially counter. Lieutenant Rodriguez appeared at the medical tent during the afternoon, ostensibly for treatment of a minor cut on his hand, but clearly needing someone to process the stress of his expanding responsibilities. As the communications officer, he was privy to intelligence reports and command decisions that were adding layers of pressure to his already demanding role. The communication intercepts we've been monitoring suggest that multiple insurgent groups are coordinating their activities, Rodriguez confided while Sarah cleaned his wound. This isn't the usual independent cell activity we've been dealing with. Someone is organizing a unified effort that could involve dozens of fighters working together. Sarah maintained her focus on treating Rodriguez's injury, while her combat-trained mind processed the implications of coordinated insurgent activity. Multiple groups working together suggested a level of planning and resources that could overwhelm a small forward operating base, especially if they had detailed intelligence about defensive positions and patrol patterns. How is command preparing for this increased threat level? Sarah asked with the concern of a medical professional worried about potential casualties. That's the million-dollar question, Rodriguez replied with frustration evident in his voice. We're increasing patrols, adjusting security rotations, and bringing in additional personnel, but there's only so much you can do with limited resources and a base that was designed for much lower threat levels. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Williams, who rarely visited the medical tent, and whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. His expression carried the weight of command decisions and the stress of responsibilities that were expanding beyond normal parameters. Martinez, I need to speak with you about emergency medical procedures, Williams said without his usual pleasantries. Command is concerned that we might face a situation where standard medical protocols won't be sufficient for the threat environment we're anticipating. Sarah set aside her supplies and gave Williams her full attention, recognizing that this conversation represented a significant shift in how command viewed the medical function on the base. What specific situations are you preparing for, Captain? Williams glanced at Rodriguez, who took the hint and excused himself from the tent. Once they were alone, Williams continued with the kind of direct communication that suggested time was becoming a critical factor. Intelligence indicates the possibility of a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm our defensive capabilities through multiple simultaneous attacks, Williams explained. In that kind of scenario, medical personnel might need to operate under conditions that go significantly beyond normal trauma care. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Williams essentially described the exact kind of situation her combat medic training had been designed to address. But maintaining her cover required her to respond with the concern of a traditional medical professional rather than someone who had extensively trained for combat medical scenarios. What modifications to medical protocols are you considering? She asked carefully. That's what I need to discuss with you, Williams replied. How confident are you in performing emergency medical procedures under potentially hostile conditions? And I mean real hostility, not just the usual stress of trauma care. The question hung in the air with implications that Sarah could feel reshaping the entire dynamic of her role on the base. Williams was essentially asking whether she could function as a combat medic without actually using the terminology that would reveal how much he understood about her true capabilities. I'm trained to maintain medical effectiveness regardless of external conditions, Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully to be truthful without revealing the extent of her combat preparation. Williams studied her response with the intensity of someone trying to assess capabilities that weren't officially documented. Good, because there's a possibility that our medical tent might need to operate as more than just a treatment facility. If we're dealing with a coordinated assault, medical personnel might need to provide care while the base is under active attack. Sarah nodded with appropriate gravity while privately acknowledging that Williams was describing exactly the kind of scenario she had trained extensively to handle. Combat medical operations under fire were a core component of her skill set, but revealing that knowledge would fundamentally change every relationship she had built on the base. I understand the implications, Captain, she said simply. Medical personnel will adapt to whatever conditions are necessary to provide effective care. Williams seemed satisfied with her response, but continued studying her with an intensity that suggested he was considering possibilities that went beyond her official role. "There's one more thing, Martinez. Command has made the decision to evacuate non-essential personnel within the next 36 hours. However, we need medical coverage to remain in place regardless of threat levels." The statement confirmed what Coleman had hinted at earlier, while adding the pressure of a definitive timeline. Sarah was being told that she would remain on the base even as other support personnel were removed for their safety, placing her in a position where her combat skills might become essential for survival. "I understand, sir," Sarah replied with the calm professionalism that had become her trademark. "Medical support will remain available regardless of circumstances." After Williams left, Sarah found herself alone with thoughts that were becoming increasingly complex. The intelligence she had gathered from various soldiers over the past several days painted a clear picture of an organized threat that was escalating rapidly towards some kind of coordinated action. Her combat training gave her tools to assess and respond to that threat that her official role didn't encompass, but using those skills would require abandoning the identity she had carefully maintained. The afternoon brought a stream of soldiers seeking routine medical care, but each interaction now carried additional weight as Sarah realized these might be among the last normal conversations she would have with her fellow soldiers. The comfortable dynamic of nurse and patient was about to be tested by circumstances that would reveal capabilities she had worked hard to keep hidden. Specialist Thompson returned for another treatment of his stress-related headaches, but his demeanor suggested that the intelligence situation had deteriorated significantly since their last conversation. His information provided the clearest picture yet of what the base was preparing to face. The latest intercepts suggest the attack is planned for tomorrow night, Thompson confided while Sarah administered medication. "Multiple groups, coordinated timing, and they seem to have detailed knowledge of our defensive positions and patrol schedules." Sarah's hands remained steady as she worked, but her mind was rapidly processing tactical implications. An attack plan for the following evening would occur after the evacuation of non-essential personnel, but before additional security reinforcements could arrive. It was a timeline that suggested enemy intelligence was sophisticated enough to identify the window of maximum vulnerability. "Are you confident in the base's ability to repel a coordinated assault?" Sarah asked with medical concern for potential casualties rather than tactical interest. "Honestly, Doc, I'm not sure anyone really knows," Thompson admitted. "We're trained and equipped for the threats we've been facing, but this represents a significant escalation. The unknowns are what keep me awake at night." Sarah understood Thompson's concerns at a level that her official role didn't encompass, but she also recognized that her combat training might provide exactly the kind of additional capability that could tip the balance in a defensive situation. The question was whether circumstances would require her to reveal those skills and fundamentally change her relationship with every soldier on the base. The evening brought news that confirmed the urgency of the situation. Colonel Harrison called an all-hands briefing that included even medical personnel, a departure from normal protocol that indicated the seriousness of the threat assessment. The briefing room filled with tension as soldiers absorbed information that transformed theoretical possibilities into immediate realities. Intelligence indicates a high probability of coordinated assault within the next 24 to 48 hours, Colonel Harrison announced without preamble. This will likely involve multiple insurgent groups working together to overwhelm our defensive capabilities through simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. Sarah listened with the same careful attention as her fellow soldiers while processing the tactical implications through her combat training. The scenario Harrison described was exactly the kind of complex threat her advanced medical training had prepared her to handle, but utilizing those skills would require decisions that went far beyond her current role. Medical personnel will remain in place to provide care during and after any engagement, Harrison continued, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's. However, all personnel should be prepared for conditions that may differ significantly from normal operations. The subtext was clear. Everyone on the base, including medical personnel, should be prepared for the possibility of combat operations under hostile conditions. Sarah realized that her carefully maintained role as the gentle nurse was about to be tested by circumstances that would reveal whether she was truly prepared for the realities of combat medicine. After the briefing, soldiers lingered in small groups, processing the implications of Harrison's announcement and discussing their preparations for what might be their first major combat engagement. Sarah found herself approached by several soldiers who seemed to draw comfort from her presence and her reputation for calm competence under pressure. "Doc, I need to ask you something," Private Anderson said with the vulnerability of someone facing his first real combat situation. "If things go bad tomorrow night, are you going to be okay? I mean, you're not trained for actual combat like the rest of us." The irony of Anderson's concern was not lost on Sarah, who possessed combat training that exceeded that of many infantry soldiers. But his question also highlighted the challenge she would face if circumstances required her to reveal her true capabilities. The soldiers who depended on her for medical care and emotional support saw her as someone to protect rather than someone who could potentially protect them. "I'll be exactly where I need to be," Sarah replied with quiet confidence that reflected her actual capabilities rather than her assumed role. Medical personnel are trained to function under difficult conditions. Anderson seemed reassured by her response, but Sarah could see in his eyes the kind of concern that reflected how completely her fellow soldiers had accepted her role as the caring nurse who needed their protection. Tomorrow's events would reveal whether that perception could survive contact with the realities of combat operations. The evacuation began before sunrise, with non-essential personnel loading into armored vehicles that would transport them to more secure facilities 50 kilometers away. Sarah watched through the medical tent as soldiers she had treated and counseled gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the base where she would remain to face whatever was coming. The irony was not lost on her that she was considered essential enough to stay, but not capable enough to be trusted with the full scope of the threat they were preparing to face. Dr. Parker was among those being evacuated, but he made a final stop at the medical tent before departure. His expression carried concern that went beyond routine professional worry, and Sarah realized he understood implications of the current situation that her official briefings hadn't fully conveyed. "Sarah, I need you to understand something that wasn't covered in the official briefings," Dr. Parker said quietly while checking his watch against the evacuation schedule. "The intelligence reports suggest this attack is specifically designed to capture medical personnel for propaganda purposes. You're not just staying behind to provide medical care. You're potentially a primary target." Sarah felt her training sharpen her focus as she processed this new information. The possibility that she was specifically targeted added layers of complexity that went far beyond routine medical support during combat operations. Her combat training had included instruction on resistance to interrogation and survival in hostile custody, but those were skills she had hoped never to need. "What does command recommend for medical personnel in that scenario?" Sarah asked, maintaining her role as concerned medical professional while privately accessing mental files on combat survival techniques. "Officially, medical personnel are supposed to rely on base security for protection," Dr. Parker replied with frustration evident in his voice. "But unofficially, I think you should be prepared for the possibility that base security might be overwhelmed by a coordinated assault specifically designed to achieve that outcome." The conversation was cut short by the arrival of transport vehicles, but Dr. Parker's parting words carried weight that extended far beyond official protocols. "Remember that sometimes the most important medical procedure is the one that keeps the medic alive to treat other patients." After the evacuation convoy departed, the base took on an entirely different atmosphere. The remaining personnel moved with the focused efficiency of soldiers preparing for combat, and Sarah found herself occupying a unique position as the only person whose primary role wasn't directly combat-related. But she also realized that her combat medic training gave her capabilities that could prove essential if the base's defensive preparations proved insufficient. Sergeant Coleman stopped by the medical tent during his final equipment check, carrying gear that suggested he understood the seriousness of the threat they were preparing to face. His demeanor had shifted from the casual familiarity of routine medical visits to the focused intensity of someone preparing for potentially his last conversation with each person on the base. "Doc, I need to tell you something that might sound strange," Coleman said while adjusting the straps on his tactical vest. "In all the months I've been coming to this tent, I've noticed things about you that don't quite add up for someone who's supposedly just a nurse." Sarah continued organizing medical supplies while her mind raced through the implications of Coleman's observation. Had her combat training shown through her carefully maintained cover in ways she hadn't realized? "What kind of things, Mike?" she asked with calm curiosity that didn't reveal her sudden alertness. "The way you move, for one thing," Coleman continued thoughtfully. "You have situational awareness that goes way beyond medical training. And your hands don't just have medical steadiness. They have the kind of precision that comes from weapons training." Sarah realized that her months of maintaining a medical role hadn't completely concealed the muscle memory and instincts that came from extensive combat training. Coleman's observational skills, sharpened by months of patrol duty, had detected inconsistencies that might be invisible to someone with less tactical experience. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mike," Sarah replied carefully, neither confirming nor denying his assessment. "What I'm suggesting," Coleman said with growing certainty, "is that maybe you're exactly the kind of person we need right now, regardless of what your official role is supposed to be. And maybe it's time to stop pretending that you don't have capabilities that could help keep all of us alive tonight." The directness of Coleman's challenge forced Sarah to confront the decision she had been avoiding. Maintaining her cover was becoming impossible under the scrutiny of soldiers whose lives might depend on understanding the true capabilities of everyone on the base. But revealing her combat training would fundamentally change every relationship she had built over the past months. "Mike, what are you really asking me?" Sarah said, meeting his eyes with an intensity that probably revealed more than she intended. "I'm asking whether the person who's been taking care of all of us for the past 6 months is prepared to do whatever it takes to make sure we all survive the next 24 hours, Coleman replied. "Even if that means doing things that aren't in the standard medical handbook." Before Sarah could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the sharp crack of gunfire from the base perimeter. Both of them instinctively dropped low and moved toward cover with reactions that were faster and more coordinated than routine medical training would account for. Coleman's eyes widened as he observed Sarah's tactical movement and weapon-ready posture. The attack had begun 12 hours earlier than intelligence had predicted, catching the base in the middle of final defensive preparations. Radio communications crackled with reports of multiple breach points and coordinated assault teams that were moving with the kind of precision that confirmed their detailed knowledge of base layout and defensive positions. "All personnel to defensive positions," Colonel Harrison's voice commanded over the base communication system. "This is not a drill. We are under coordinated assault from multiple vectors." Sarah felt her combat training take over as she automatically assessed the medical tent's defensive vulnerabilities and escape routes. Her hands moved to secure critical medical supplies, while her mind cataloged the weapons and equipment that would be available if circumstances required her to abandon her medical role for combat operations. Coleman was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with his squad while keeping one eye on Sarah's preparations. What he saw clearly surprised him. Instead of the concerned nurse taking shelter, he was watching someone who moved with tactical precision and situational awareness that matched his own combat experience. "Doc, I think it's time to drop the act," Coleman said urgently as explosions from the perimeter indicated that the attackers had brought heavier weapons than routine intelligence had suggested. "We need every capable person in this fight, and I'm pretty sure you're a lot more capable than anyone realizes." The sound of approaching gunfire made the decision for Sarah. Maintaining her cover identity was no longer possible when survival required utilizing every available resource and capability. Her months of playing the gentle nurse were about to end in a revelation that would shock every soldier on the base. "Mike, I need you to understand something," Sarah said while rapidly converting the medical tent from a treatment facility into a tactical position. "Everything you've observed about me, is accurate. I'm not just a nurse, and I never was. Coleman's expression shifted from suspicion to relief as Sarah's acknowledgement confirmed what his instincts had been telling him for months. What exactly are we talking about here, Doc? I'm a fully qualified combat medic with advanced tactical training, Sarah replied, while checking the action on a sidearm that Coleman hadn't seen her retrieve from her medical supplies. I've been maintaining medical cover because that's what this base needed, but my actual capabilities include combat operations under fire. The revelation transformed Coleman's understanding of Sarah and the medical tent's role in the base's defensive capabilities. Instead of a vulnerable position that needed protection, the medical facility suddenly became a potential strong point with a defender whose training matched the threat they were facing. Holy hell, Doc, Coleman breathed as the reality of Sarah's dual identity sank in. How many people know about this? Until about 30 seconds ago, just command and the medical officers who rotate through here, Sarah replied while rapidly assembling equipment that transformed her from medical caregiver to combat-ready soldier. But circumstances have changed, and maintaining cover is no longer possible. Radio communications indicated that the assault was proceeding exactly as intelligence had predicted, with multiple teams attacking different sections of the perimeter, while a specialized unit moved toward the center of the base where high-value targets would be located. Sarah realized that Dr. Parker's warning about medical personnel being specifically targeted was about to be tested under actual combat conditions. Coleman, I need you to get word to your squad leaders that the medical tent is now a defensive position rather than a location to be protected, Sarah said while completing her transformation from nurse to combat medic. And I need you to understand that everything about how you've seen me for the past 6 months is about to change. Coleman was already moving toward the tent entrance when a burst of automatic weapons fire struck the canvas wall behind where Sarah had been standing moments before. The attack on the medical tent had begun, confirming that insurgent forces were indeed targeting medical personnel as part of their strategic objectives. Looks like they're specifically coming for you, Doc, Coleman said while returning fire through the tent opening. Good thing you're not actually the helpless nurse they think they're attacking. Sarah felt her combat training fully engage as she assessed the tactical situation and began implementing defensive procedures that her medical role had never encompassed. The gentle caregiver who had bandaged wounds and offered comfort was rapidly being replaced by someone whose primary concern was eliminating threats and maintaining tactical advantage. The sound of advancing footsteps indicated that multiple attackers were approaching the medical tent from different directions, coordinating their assault with the kind of precision that suggested extensive rehearsal. Sarah realized that the insurgent intelligence about base layout and personnel had been accurate enough to identify her location and plan a specific operation designed to capture the base's medical officer. How many are we looking at? Sarah asked while establishing fields of fire that would cover all approaches to the medical tent. Radio reports suggest at least 8 fighters moving toward this position, Coleman replied while reloading his weapon. But here's the thing, Doc, my squad is pinned down at the eastern perimeter and backup won't reach us for at least 10 minutes. Sarah processed the tactical mathematics with the cold efficiency her training had instilled. 8 attackers against 2 defenders in a position that offered limited cover and multiple entry points represented odds that would require every advantage they could create. Her combat skills were about to be tested under exactly the kind of circumstances her training had prepared her for. Coleman, from this moment forward, forget everything you think you know about my capabilities, Sarah said while positioning herself to cover the tent's primary entrance. I'm about to show you what a combat medic actually does when a medical mission requires engaging enemy forces. The first attacker appeared at the tent entrance, expecting to find a frightened nurse hiding among medical supplies. Instead, he encountered Sarah Martinez in full combat mode, moving with tactical precision and engaging threats with the kind of lethal efficiency that comes from extensive specialized training. Coleman watched in amazement as Sarah systematically neutralized attackers with techniques that went far beyond basic military training. Her movement, weapon handling, and tactical decision-making demonstrated capabilities that transformed the medical tent from a vulnerable target into a deadly trap for insurgent forces who had planned their assault based on incomplete intelligence. Jesus, Doc, Coleman breathed during a brief lull in the fighting. Where the hell did you learn to do that? Advanced Combat Medical Specialist Training, Sarah replied while reloading and assessing the continuing threat. It turns out that keeping medical personnel alive in combat zones sometimes requires capabilities that go significantly beyond traditional nursing skills. The revelation was transforming Coleman's understanding not just of Sarah, but of the entire concept of medical support in combat environments. Instead of personnel who needed protection, he was discovering that properly trained medical officers could provide significant combat capability while maintaining their primary mission of saving lives. Radio communications indicated that the assault on other sections of the base was proceeding with mixed success, but the attack on the medical tent had failed completely due to the unexpected resistance they had encountered. Sarah realized that her decision to reveal her combat capabilities might have implications that went far beyond their immediate survival. Coleman, when this is over, every soldier on this base is going to want to know how the quiet nurse turned into whatever they just witnessed, Sarah said while maintaining watch on potential approach routes. Are you prepared for that conversation? Doc, after what I just saw, I think the real question is whether the rest of the base is prepared to learn what kind of person has actually been taking care of them all this time, Coleman replied with newfound respect evident in his voice. The sound of approaching friendly forces indicated that base security was beginning to regain control of the situation, but Sarah realized that her months of maintaining medical cover had ended permanently. Tomorrow would bring questions about her true identity and capabilities that would fundamentally change her role on the base, and her relationships with every soldier who had trusted the gentle nurse with their fears and vulnerabilities. But for now, her immediate concern was ensuring that she and Coleman survived long enough to have those conversations. The attack on the medical tent had been repelled, but radio reports suggested that the overall assault was far from over, and her combat capabilities might be needed again before the night was finished. The aftermath of the ambush revealed the true scope of the coordinated assault that had targeted the base with precision that spoke to months of careful planning and intelligence gathering. Sarah found herself at the center of casualty treatment operations that required every aspect of her medical training, while soldiers processed the shock of discovering that their gentle nurse possessed combat capabilities that exceeded those of many infantry specialists. Lieutenant Rodriguez arrived at the medical tent carrying Private Chun, who had sustained shrapnel wounds during the perimeter fighting. His expression showed the kind of confusion that Sarah realized she would be seeing frequently as word spread about her dual identity and the combat effectiveness she had demonstrated during the attack on the medical facility. Doc, I need to ask you something that's probably going to sound strange, Rodriguez said while helping Chun onto the examination table. Coleman is telling everyone that you single-handedly eliminated 4 insurgent fighters using tactics that looked like advanced special operations training. Please tell me he's exaggerating due to combat stress. Sarah began treating Chen's wounds with the same gentle efficiency that had characterized her medical care for months, but she could sense that her patients were now studying her with entirely different expectations. The comfortable dynamic between caring nurse and grateful patients had been permanently altered by revelations that would reshape every future interaction. Coleman's report is accurate, Sarah replied while cleaning Chen's wounds. My training includes combat capabilities that I haven't needed to utilize until tonight. Chun winced as Sarah worked, but managed to voice the question that was clearly troubling both her and Rodriguez. So, when we've been talking to you about our fears and concerns about combat, you've actually had more combat training than most of us. The directness of Chen's question highlighted the complexity of Sarah's situation. Her months of providing emotional support and medical care have been based on soldiers believing she was someone who needed their protection rather than someone who could potentially protect them. Now, they were discovering that many of their assumptions about her capabilities and background had been incomplete. My combat training was designed to support medical operations under hostile conditions, Sarah explained while bandaging Chen's arm. But, yes, that training is probably more extensive than what most infantry soldiers receive. Rodriguez processed this information while watching Sarah work with skills that now seem to carry additional implications. So, when you've been counseling us about dealing with combat stress and operational pressure, you've been speaking from actual experience rather than just medical textbook knowledge. The revelation was forcing all of them to reconsider months of interactions and conversations that had seemed to establish clear roles and relationships. Sarah realized that her fellow soldiers were having to completely reconstruct their understanding of who she was and what her presence on the base actually represented. I've been providing medical care and emotional support based on my training and experience, Sarah said carefully. The fact that my training included combat operations doesn't diminish the validity of the care I've provided. Captain Williams appeared at the medical tent entrance, his expression carrying the weight of command decisions that had been complicated by the evening's revelations. Behind him, Sarah could see several other soldiers who seemed to be waiting for clarification about the medical officer whose true capabilities had emerged during the crisis. Martinez, I need a full briefing on your actual qualifications and training background, Williams said without his usual pleasantries. Command needs to understand what resources are actually available for future operations. Sarah realized that Williams was essentially asking her to abandon completely the medical cover she had maintained for months and provide a complete accounting of capabilities that might change how command viewed her role on the base. It was a conversation that would determine whether she could continue serving as the caring medical officer or whether her combat skills would become her primary value to the unit. Sir, my official designation is Advanced Combat Medical Specialist with supplementary training in tactical operations, urban warfare, and hostile environment medicine, Sarah replied with military precision that contrasted sharply with her usual gentle demeanor. Williams studied her response while considering implications that clearly went beyond his previous understanding of medical support capabilities. What exactly does that training encompass in terms of combat effectiveness? Advanced weapons training, tactical movement and communications, field surgery under fire, and survival techniques for hostile territory, Sarah replied, each item adding weight to Williams' assessment of her true value to the unit. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Specialist Thompson, whose intelligence background made him particularly interested in understanding how Sarah's deception had remained undetected for months. His approach carried the analytical intensity of someone trying to piece together a puzzle that had implications beyond personal curiosity. Doc, I've been thinking about our conversations over the past months, Thompson said while Williams continued to process the scope of Sarah's actual training. When I was sharing intelligence about insurgent activities, were you analyzing that information through combat training rather than just medical concern? Sarah realized that Thompson was beginning to understand that her months of listening to intelligence reports and tactical observations had been filtered through combat training that gave her capabilities for threat assessment that her medical role hadn't officially encompassed. Her fellow soldiers were discovering that they had been sharing sensitive information with someone whose background included exactly the kind of training needed to utilize that intelligence effectively. I was processing all information through both medical and tactical perspectives, Sarah admitted. My training requires maintaining awareness of threats that could affect medical operations. Thompson nodded slowly as pieces of the puzzle began fitting together in ways that revealed the sophistication of Sarah's dual role. So, when you were asking questions about our patrol routes and defensive positions, you were actually conducting your own threat assessment based on combat training. The implications of Thompson's realization were becoming clear to everyone present. Sarah hadn't just been the caring nurse who bandaged wounds and offered comfort. She had been continuously analyzing the tactical situation through combat training that had prepared her to recognize and respond to exactly the kind of coordinated threat they had faced. My questions were motivated by medical preparedness for potential casualty scenarios, Sarah replied, maintaining technical accuracy while acknowledging the broader implications of her intelligence gathering. Williams was clearly reassessing Sarah's value to the unit as the scope of her capabilities became apparent. Martinez, given your actual training and tonight's demonstration of combat effectiveness, Command needs to consider whether your role should be modified to reflect your full capabilities. Sarah understood that Williams was essentially asking whether she wanted to abandon her medical role entirely in favor of combat operations. But she also recognized that her months of providing emotional support and medical care had created relationships that couldn't be easily replaced by someone with purely combat credentials. Sir, I believe my most effective contribution continues to be medical support enhanced by combat capabilities when circumstances require, Sarah replied. Tonight demonstrated that sometimes medical personnel need defensive capabilities, but that doesn't negate the primary importance of medical care. Private Anderson appeared at the tent entrance, his left arm supported by a makeshift sling that indicated he had been wounded during the perimeter fighting. His expression showed the kind of confusion that Sarah was beginning to recognize as soldiers struggled to reconcile their image of the caring nurse with the combat-effective soldier they had discovered. "Doc, I need medical attention, but I also need to understand something," Anderson said while settling onto the examination table. "When I told you I was scared about combat, and you gave me advice about managing fear, were you speaking as someone who actually understood what I was going through?" Sarah began examining Anderson's injured arm while considering how to address questions that revealed how completely her dual identity had shaped interactions she had thought were based on straightforward medical relationships. Her fellow soldiers were realizing that someone they had seen as needing protection had actually possessed capabilities that might have helped protect them. "Anderson, when I counseled you about combat stress, I was drawing on both medical training and personal understanding of operational pressures," Sarah replied while assessing his injury. "My advice was valid regardless of the source of my knowledge." Anderson nodded thoughtfully while Sarah worked, but his expression suggested he was processing implications that went beyond immediate medical care. "It's strange to think that the person we've all been trying to protect has actually been more prepared for combat than most of us." The irony was not lost on Sarah that her months of allowing soldiers to see her as someone vulnerable had created a dynamic where her true capabilities remained hidden until circumstances forced their revelation. Her combat training had taught her that sometimes the most effective approach was allowing adversaries to underestimate your capabilities, but she hadn't anticipated applying that principle to relationships with fellow soldiers. "Your concern for my safety has been appreciated," Sarah said while bandaging Anderson's arm. "But tonight demonstrated that medical personnel with proper training can contribute to defensive operations while maintaining their primary medical mission." Colonel Harrison arrived at the medical tent as Sarah was finishing Anderson's treatment, his presence indicating that command-level decisions were being made about how to integrate the evening's revelations into future operational planning. Behind him, Sarah could see other base personnel who seemed to be waiting for official clarification about her role and capabilities. "Martinez, I need to address some assumptions that have been guiding our operational planning," Harrison said with command authority that made clear this was an official inquiry rather than casual conversation. "For 6 months, we've been operating under the belief that our medical officer required protection during hostile situations. Tonight's events suggest that assumption may have been incorrect." Sarah realized that Harrison was asking her to provide an official assessment of her capabilities that would determine how command viewed medical support in future operations. Her answer would affect not just her own role, but potentially the deployment and utilization of medical personnel throughout the unit. "Sir, my training includes defensive capabilities that allow medical operations to continue under hostile conditions," Sarah replied with military precision. Tonight demonstrated that properly trained medical personnel can contribute to base security while maintaining medical readiness. Harrison nodded while considering implications that clearly affected his assessment of base defense capabilities and personnel allocation. Given tonight's demonstration of your combat effectiveness, Command is reassessing the role of medical personnel in defensive operations. The conversation was interrupted by radio communications indicating that insurgent forces were regrouping for what intelligence suggested might be a second coordinated assault. The evening's fighting had apparently been a probing attack designed to test base defenses and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a larger operation. All personnel prepare for potential secondary assault, Harrison announced over base communications. Intelligence indicates enemy forces remain in the area and may be planning follow-up operations. Sarah felt her combat training engage once again as she prepared the medical tent for the possibility of additional combat operations. But now her preparations were being observed by soldiers who understood her true capabilities and were beginning to see the medical facility as a potential strongpoint rather than a vulnerable position requiring protection. Sergeant Coleman returned to the medical tent as part of defensive preparations, his expression showing a mixture of respect and amazement that reflected his new understanding of Sarah's capabilities. His presence also indicated that word of her combat effectiveness was spreading throughout the base and changing how other soldiers viewed the medical support function. "Doc, half the base is talking about what happened here tonight," Coleman said while checking his equipment and assessing defensive positions. "But the other half still can't believe that our gentle nurse turned into some kind of special operations soldier when the situation required it." Sarah understood that Coleman was describing the challenge she would face in maintaining relationships with soldiers who had trusted her with their vulnerabilities while processing the revelation that she possessed capabilities they hadn't imagined. The comfortable dynamic of caregiver and patient had been permanently altered by circumstances that revealed the complexity of her dual identity. "Mike, I'm still the same person who has been providing medical care for the past 6 months," Sarah said while completing preparations that demonstrated both medical and tactical competence. "Tonight's events revealed additional capabilities, but they don't change my commitment to the medical mission." Coleman nodded, but continued studying Sarah with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested he was still processing the implications of her transformation from vulnerable nurse to combat-effective soldier. "The thing is, Doc, knowing what you're actually capable of changes how all of us think about medical support and base defense." The observation highlighted the broader impact of Sarah's revelation on unit dynamics and operational planning. Her fellow soldiers were having to reconsider assumptions about medical personnel, defensive capabilities, and the roles that different specialists could play in combat situations. The evening's events had revealed resources and capabilities that Command hadn't factored into their tactical planning. Radio communications indicated that the anticipated second assault was beginning to develop, with enemy forces moving into positions that suggested another coordinated attack on multiple fronts. Sarah realized that her combat capabilities would likely be tested again before the night was over, and this time her fellow soldiers would be watching with full knowledge of what she was actually capable of accomplishing. The second assault began with the kind of coordinated precision that indicated enemy forces had learned from their first attempt and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Sarah found herself operating simultaneously as combat medic and defensive fighter, treating wounded soldiers while maintaining tactical awareness that kept the medical tent functioning as both treatment facility and strongpoint. The revelation of her dual identity had fundamentally changed how every soldier on the base understood medical support and defensive capabilities. Captain Williams established a command post adjacent to the medical tent, recognizing that Sarah's combination of medical skills and combat effectiveness made her position central to both casualty treatment and defensive operations. His presence indicated that Command had rapidly integrated the evening's revelations into operational planning and was beginning to utilize resources that hadn't been officially recognized before the crisis. "Martinez, we're getting reports of multiple casualties from the eastern perimeter," Williams said while coordinating defensive positions through radio communications. "But intelligence also suggests that enemy forces are planning another direct assault on this position based on their previous failure here." Sarah processed both pieces of information through her dual training, understanding that she would need to provide medical care for incoming casualties while preparing for the possibility of additional combat operations. The complexity of maintaining both roles simultaneously represented exactly the kind of challenge her advanced training had been designed to address. Sir, the medical tent can function as a casualty collection point while maintaining defensive capability, Sarah replied while organizing supplies and equipment for both medical and combat operations. My training allows for simultaneous medical and tactical operations under hostile conditions. The first casualties arrived as Sarah was speaking, carried by soldiers whose expressions showed a mixture of urgency about their wounded comrades and curiosity about the medical officer whose combat capabilities had become legendary in the few hours since the first assault. Specialist Thompson and Private Chen supported a seriously wounded soldier whose injuries required immediate advanced medical intervention. Doc Rodriguez took a direct hit from an improvised explosive device during the perimeter fighting, Thompson said while helping to position the injured soldier on the examination table. He's got massive trauma to his lower extremities and significant blood loss. Sarah's medical training took precedence as she immediately began life-saving procedures that required every aspect of her advanced medical skills. But her situational awareness, sharpened by combat training, continued monitoring for threats while she worked to stabilize Rodriguez's condition under circumstances that tested both her medical and tactical capabilities. I need both of you to establish security positions while I work, Sarah instructed Thompson and Chen while beginning surgical procedures under field conditions. Intelligence suggests this position remains a target for enemy assault. Thompson and Chun moved to cover defensive positions with the kind of coordination that reflected their new understanding of the medical tent's role in base defense. Sarah realized that her fellow soldiers were beginning to adapt to the concept of medical facilities that could function as tactical positions rather than vulnerable locations requiring protection. Rodriguez's injuries required advanced surgical techniques that pushed Sarah's medical skills to their limits, while incoming radio communications indicated that enemy forces were indeed moving toward another assault on the medical tent. The combination of life-or-death medical procedures and imminent combat operations represented the exact scenario her specialized training had prepared her for. Doc, his blood pressure is dropping fast, Chen observed while monitoring Rodriguez's condition and maintaining watch for approaching threats. Are you going to be able to stabilize him before they hit us again? Sarah's hands continued their precise work while her combat-trained mind calculated timing and tactical probabilities. Rodriguez's survival depended on completing complex medical procedures, but the approaching assault meant that defensive preparations couldn't be delayed much longer. Her training had taught her to function effectively under exactly this kind of multiple pressure. Chun, I need you to prepare defensive positions while I complete this surgical repair, Sarah said without interrupting her medical work. Thompson established communication with command and request immediate evacuation for critical casualties. The coordination of medical care and defensive preparations demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond traditional nursing or even standard combat medical training. Sarah was functioning as both life-saving medical professional and tactical coordinator, roles that her specialized training had integrated into a seamless operational capability. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled over radio communications with updates that added urgency to the already critical situation. Medical tent, be advised that enemy forces are approximately 5 minutes from your position. Critical casualties need immediate evacuation or field stabilization. Sarah processed Harrison's information while completing surgical procedures that were literally keeping Rodriguez alive. The timeline meant that she had to finish life-saving medical work and prepare for combat operations simultaneously, requiring every aspect of her dual training to function under maximum pressure. Sir, casualties are stabilized, but will require continued medical monitoring during any defensive action, Sarah replied over radio while completing Rodriguez's treatment. Medical tent remains operational for both casualty care and defensive operations. Private Anderson arrived carrying additional medical supplies, his expression showing the kind of confidence that reflected the base's new understanding of medical support capabilities. Instead of bringing supplies to a vulnerable nurse who needed protection, he was resupplying a combat-effective medical professional who had demonstrated her ability to maintain operations under hostile conditions. Doc, Command sent additional ammunition and medical supplies, Anderson said while rapidly distributing materials that supported both aspects of Sarah's dual role. They also wanted me to tell you that your combat effectiveness has changed how they're planning defensive operations for the entire base. Sarah understood that Anderson was describing a fundamental shift in how Command viewed medical personnel and their potential contribution to combat operations. Her revelation of combat capabilities was having implications that went beyond her individual role and were affecting tactical planning for the entire unit. Anderson, help me move Rodriguez to a more protected position, Sarah said, while maintaining awareness of approaching threats. Then, establish a defensive position that covers the northern approach to the tent. The coordination of medical evacuation and defensive preparations demonstrated how Sarah's dual training allowed her to integrate different operational requirements into effective action under extreme pressure. Her fellow soldiers were learning to work with medical personnel who possessed capabilities they hadn't previously imagined. Sergeant Coleman returned to the medical tent, leading a squad that had been assigned to support defensive operations, his presence indicating that Command had officially recognized the medical facility as a tactical position rather than simply a treatment location. The integration of medical and combat operations was becoming formalized through official unit assignments. Doc, Command has designated the medical tent as Strongpoint Alpha for defensive operations, Coleman announced while positioning his squad in coordinated defensive positions. Your combat effectiveness has turned this into a key defensive position for the entire base perimeter. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern as she realized that her revelation of combat capabilities was transforming not just her own role, but how the entire base approached integrated operations. Medical support was no longer seen as a separate function requiring protection, but as an integral component of defensive capability. Coleman, your squad needs to understand that this position maintains both medical and tactical functions, Sarah said while completing final preparations for the anticipated assault. Wounded soldiers will continue arriving for treatment even during active combat operations. The complexity of maintaining simultaneous medical and combat operations represented exactly the kind of challenge that had driven the development of advanced combat medical training. Sarah was about to demonstrate capabilities that most military units didn't fully understand or utilize effectively. Radio communications indicated that the second assault was beginning with enemy forces approaching from multiple directions in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm defensive positions through simultaneous pressure. Sarah realized that her combat skills would be tested under conditions that would reveal the true value of her specialized training. All defensive positions, enemy contact in 30 seconds, Colonel Harrison's voice announced over base communications. Medical personnel maintained treatment capability while contributing to defensive operations as circumstances allow. Sarah understood that Harrison was officially authorizing her to utilize combat capabilities while maintaining medical responsibilities, formalizing the dual role that circumstances had forced her to reveal. The gentle nurse who had provided comfort and healing was now officially recognized as a combat-effective soldier whose skills were essential for base survival. The assault began with automatic weapons fire that required immediate defensive response, while wounded soldiers continued arriving at the medical tent for life-saving treatment. Sarah found herself moving seamlessly between combat engagement and medical care, demonstrating capabilities that integrated both functions into effective action under maximum stress. Private Chun arrived supporting another wounded soldier whose injuries required immediate medical attention, but Her approach to the medical tent now reflected understanding of its tactical significance rather than assumption that it represented a safe haven from combat operations. Doc, Williams took shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade, Chun said while helping to position the wounded soldier for treatment. But enemy forces are moving directly toward this position, and we're going to need every defensive capability available. Sarah began treating Williams's injuries while maintaining tactical awareness that allowed her to coordinate medical care with defensive operations. Her fellow soldiers were learning to work with medical personnel whose capabilities extended far beyond traditional expectations. Chun established communication with evacuation teams while I stabilized Williams. Sarah instructed while performing medical procedures that required precision under combat conditions. Then, prepare to assist with defensive operations as needed. The integration of medical care and combat operations demonstrated how Sarah's specialized training allowed her to maintain both functions simultaneously under conditions that would overwhelm personnel with single-role training. Her dual capabilities were proving essential for operational effectiveness under extreme circumstances. Specialist Thompson provided covering fire, while Sarah worked on Williams. His movements coordinated with her medical procedures in ways that reflected their growing understanding of how to support integrated operations. The medical tent had become a tactical position where healing and fighting functioned together rather than as separate activities. Doc, enemy forces are within 100 meters and closing fast, Thompson reported while maintaining defensive vigilance. Are you going to be able to complete medical procedures before we need full defensive commitment? Sarah's hands continued their precise medical work while her combat-trained awareness processed tactical information and calculated timing requirements. Williams's survival depended on completing medical treatment, but defensive operations would soon require her full tactical attention. Thompson, I need 60 seconds to complete life-saving procedures, Sarah replied, while working with speed that reflected both medical skill and combat urgency. Then, this position converts to full defensive mode. The countdown to combat operations while maintaining critical medical care represented the ultimate test of Sarah's dual training. Her specialized skills were being utilized under conditions that revealed why advanced combat medical training had been developed and how it could prove essential for operational success. Radio communications crackled with reports that indicated the assault was proceeding according to enemy planning, but that defensive preparations had been enhanced by recognition of capabilities that hadn't been factored into original tactical assessments. Sarah's revelation of combat effectiveness was contributing to defensive success beyond her individual position. Medical tent. This is Colonel Harrison, the radio announced as Sarah completed Williams's treatment and prepared for combat operations. Your demonstrated capabilities have exceeded all expectations and contributed significantly to successful base defense. Well done, Martinez. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and relief as she realized that her months of maintaining medical cover had ended with official recognition of her true value to the unit. The gentle nurse who had provided comfort and healing had revealed herself as someone whose capabilities extended far beyond traditional expectations, but who remained committed to the medical mission that had defined her service. Sir, medical operations remain my primary mission, Sarah replied while completing her transition to full combat readiness. Tonight demonstrated that properly trained medical personnel can enhance defensive capability while maintaining medical effectiveness. The second assault reached its climax as Sarah engaged enemy forces with combat skills that had remained hidden for months, while simultaneously coordinating medical evacuation for casualties whose lives depended on her continued availability. Her dual identity had been permanently revealed, but her commitment to both healing and protection had been demonstrated under the most challenging circumstances possible. As the assault was finally repelled and enemy forces withdrew, Sarah found herself surrounded by soldiers whose understanding of medical support had been fundamentally transformed. The caring nurse who had bandaged their wounds and listened to their fears had revealed herself as someone whose capabilities included protecting them in ways they had never imagined, while never abandoning her commitment to healing and care. The morning would bring questions about how her dual identity had remained concealed and what it meant for future operations, but Sarah understood that she had found a way to serve her fellow soldiers that honored both aspects of her training and demonstrated that sometimes the most effective way to care for people is to possess the capability to protect them when circumstances require it. The med tent girl had revealed herself as a combat medic whose gentle healing touch was matched by the strength to fight for those she had dedicated herself to protecting.